asylums with doors open wide, where people had paid to see inside. For entertainment, they watched his body twist. Behind his eyes, he says, I still exist. This is the way. Step inside. This season of Extra Sci-Fi is sponsored by some of the finest content curators in the game, CuriosityStream. Want to watch their awesome stuff free for 30 days? Then use the invite code EXTRACREDITS at the link below. Now, we usually start these off with a quote from one of the author's books. Today, instead, we've started with some Joy Division lyrics, and I think J.G. Ballard would have appreciated that. While his vision of a dystopic future, consumed by its own consumerism, would pave the way for cyberpunk, Ballard's work influenced people across the arts. Not only would Joy Division sing about his worlds, but everyone from Manic Street Preachers to Madonna to Gary Newman would be inspired by his writing. Even Video Killed the Radio Star came from reading a Ballard story. So today, rather than relate a scene from one of his stories, we're going to talk about his life and his work as a whole. Because in his writing, you'll find some of the most beautiful descriptions of decaying cities and strange landscapes, side by side with some of the most obscene and disturbing passages ever to grace the work of a major science fiction author. Born in Shanghai in 1930, his formative years were defined by the Japanese invasion of China during the Second World War. His family was interned, and he witnessed firsthand the horrors of war. While his childhood wasn't without fond memories, he did say that the horrors he witnessed there allowed him to see the reassuring stage set that everyday reality in the suburban West presents us, torn down, and instead see the ragged scaffolding and the truth beyond that. And it shows in his work. As a young man, he studied psychology, almost becoming a psychologist before turning to science fiction. Science fiction that would explore the darkest recesses of the human psyche. Sex, death, and the decay of the fragile facade we call modern civilization permeates his writing. Ideas that led him away from the mainstream sci-fi that was still anchored to the Golden Age and made him one of the standard bearers for the new wave. But there are three distinct periods in Ballard's work, and it's those we're going to break down here today. First is what I'd call his worlds period. By the early 60s, he had decided to be a full-time writer, and in a flurry of writing between 1962 and 1966, he released a host of short story collections, and every 2 years, like clockwork, a novel. These novels would be titled The Drowned World, The Burning World, and The Crystal World. These are all post-apocalyptic novels that explore different kinds of apocalypses. In the Drowned World, increased solar radiation has melted the ice caps and increased precipitation to the point where all but the farthest reaches of the Earth have become inhospitable swamps. In the Burning World, industrial pollution has interfered with the water cycle and humanity lives in perpetual drought, fighting over the last fresh water to be found. And finally, in what is perhaps his strangest of these novels, The Crystal World addresses a mysterious phenomena that causes living organisms to crystallize and which is spreading at an ever-growing rate. But what all of his novels and short stories from this period really feature is the psychology of isolation, what it means to be profoundly alone, to be disconnected and cut off from society, and how, even though that may be destructive for us in any context we can conceive of through our modern societal lens, it can also be something that we might crave. But then this period comes to an abrupt end. In 1965, Ballard's wife dies suddenly. His world is shattered, and his writing becomes a visceral expression of rage and grief. We'll call this his atrocities period. And it begins with his most famous and perhaps most controversial novel, The Atrocity Exhibition. It's his most Burroughs-esque of his novels, with section titles such as The Great American Nude, The Summer Cannibals, Tolerances of the Human Face, and of course, the ever-famous Why I Wanna F*** Ronald Reagan. It's a deep dive into the shattered psyche, featuring a protagonist who was a psychologist, but who the overwhelming and seemingly illogical nature of the modern world has reduced to complete psychosis. Most of the chapters deal with real events, filtered through the frame of someone who has to relate these events to himself in order to make any sense of them. So they become a damaged, distraught, and sexual wonderland for the reader to wander through. Of course, it immediately got him charged with obscenity, and almost every copy of the book was destroyed before it ever hit the shelves. But those who did read it were hit with this primal scream of a book. A novel that was at once his most punk rock, his most transgressive, and perhaps his most incoherent. But coherence wasn't the point. The point was the scream, was the idea of laying out the perverse as beautiful, and what society would call degenerate as the only sane response to a fundamentally insane world. And to this point, we have Ballard himself becoming obsessed with one of his own chapters, a chapter called Crash. He goes so far as to arrange an art exhibition in London that is nothing but the bodies of crashed cars. And finally, to turn this story into his next novel, Crash. It's the tale of people who are sexually aroused by car crashes, and features Ballard himself as the narrator. Now, the book can be taken as being about our hunger for tragedy, our society's voyeuristic gaze at the latest car wreck, whether it be a mass shooting, a plane crash, or a natural disaster. But taken literally, this is a book about repulsive people using each other for repulsive ends. Needless to say, people were horrified when the book came out, but that didn't stop Ballard. Soon after, he wrote Highrise, a story about an apartment building that is totally self-contained, with its own supermarkets and schools, that descends into tribalism and violence as the inhabitants cut themselves off from the rest of the world and focus totally on life within their high-rise. You know, something in there seems relevant today. I digress. This, though, nearly ends Ballard's atrocities period. For a few years later, he'd write a semi-fictional autobiography about what it was like to be a young Westerner living through the occupation of Shanghai called Empire of the Sun. And this would catapult him to international success and worldwide recognition. I call everything after this his Empire period, which we're not going to talk about for too long, because while he still writes about dystopias after this, none of those novels are quite as transgressive, aggressive, or for that matter rooted in science fiction as some of his earlier works. So if you have the stomach for it, and want to read the works of someone who boldly declared that there were no limits on science fiction, either in terms of content or in terms of writing style, try picking up The Terminal Beach. It's a series of short stories from his Worlds period that are powerful in their own right. Not to mention, a really good place to stick your toe in and see if the strange visions of J.G. Ballard are for you. Thank you to CuriosityStream for sponsoring this season of Extra Sci-Fi. Their cultivated platform of documentaries and nonfiction titles spans a gamut of topics across science, nature, history, technology, society, and lifestyle. In fact, I lost myself in one particularly saucy literary look back entitled Frankenstein and the Vampire: A Dark and Stormy Night, which recounts a fateful evening that birthed not only the modern vampire myth, but also the tale that started our Extra Sci-Fi series, and of course science fiction proper, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Cue lightning crash! Thank you. And you can bring learning to life with unlimited access to this and other amazing stories, starting at just $2.99 a month or $19.99 a year. Plus, if you head to curiositystream.com/extra credits and use the invite code extra credits, you can even get your first 30 days free.